Ideas, the show where we look at misfires, mistakes, and miscalculations from all through history.
I'm Tony Southcott.
Tony, what is our bad idea for the week?
The bad idea is the story behind the E.T. video game.
Okay. I've heard of this.
Our story starts under the sands of a New Mexico desert, where there's rumored to be a forgotten tomb of old Atari games, mostly filled with the remnants of the E.T. game. They made millions and millions of cartridges for the E.T. video game, and basically it ended up being one of the worst video games of all time, and there's a lot of reasons for this. But basically the urban legend goes that Atari took these out to the desert and just buried them rather than dealing with them. They just got rid of them. And that's an urban legend that's been going around for a long time now, something like almost 30 years. It happened in 1983, and ever since that point, the E.T. game has kind of been synonymous with being the worst game ever, and it's a lot of times accused of being the game that actually killed Atari. So to start out, this is one of the first video game adaptations that have been out there. The first one was actually Raiders of the Lost Ark, which Atari did for Steven Spielberg. That game was a huge success. It was actually pretty well rated, which is very rare for movie video game adaptations. And the studio was wanting to get Steven Spielberg more involved with them, so they offered an immense amount of money to get the E.T. game. They paid more than $20 million just to get the rights to make the E.T. video game.
That's a lot of money. It seems like if you're going to spend that much money, you're probably negotiating for a while with somebody like Steven Spielberg.
Yeah, and that was a big part of the problem because they had talks that went on way too long, and essentially that made it so that the video game only had 5.5 weeks to get finished. So you're talking about less than 6 weeks from start to finish on a game that usually would take 5 to 6 months to complete. But let's take a step back. A lot of people that are listening to this show probably don't remember the Atari 2600. It was before I was born. I never had one. I got to play on one occasionally at a friend's house. But the Atari basically brought video games into the home. Before, you had these giant consoles. Everybody's seen them, like the Pac-Man type stuff. And basically you had to go to the arcade to play it. And millennials, they used to be coin operated. I'm sure you've heard of this from 80s movies, whatever.
The big thing about Atari also was not that they brought video gaming into the home, because that had been done before, right? We had Pong. As Tony mentioned, there were Pac-Man machines for the home. Atari's big idea was the switchable cartridge.
Yeah, because you could pay a lot of money to get just Pong in your house, and a lot of people did. But that's all it could do. It only played Pong. And with the Atari 2600, you could actually just get a new cartridge, shove a new game in there, and have as many games as you wanted. It was a huge revolution for home entertainment, and it was for a lot of people the first any type of computer that they had in their house. After Atari saw immediate success with this cartridge-based system where they were giving graphics that were as good as what you saw in arcades, they kind of got a little bit overconfident in a lot of different respects. They started kind of living a rock and roll lifestyle for their developers. Like, a lot of these developers would actually go to work wearing just shorts. There was a lot of booze, a lot of illegal drugs, a lot of other things going on all the time that was supposed to help foster creativity and morale among the hardworking developers.
It's very much, I would say, similar to a lot of Silicon Valley mindset today. There's still companies that come up with that kind of come in and make your own hours, just work real hard and do cool stuff, and we're all renegade hacker types. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's something you see from Google and a lot of other companies. And you really do need a few of those amenities because you're going to be there 20 hours some days.
You definitely need that cocaine if you're going to be there 20 hours.
Yeah, or what most people are on now, which is ProVigil. But that's an entirely different thing for Silicon Valley. At this point, we have Howard Scott Warshaw enter the picture. He goes over to Atari. He shows up the first day. He's got a joint in his pocket, and he just wants to fit in. They don't exactly know what he's capable of, so they tell him to just port over one of the old box, coin-op games called Star Castle. And he ends up taking this and turns it into one of the best games that was ever created for Atari, called Yars Revenge. And it's one of the first, it actually is the very first video game that has a backstory. It's not just, okay, you're just all of a sudden fighting asteroids or whatever. So, this ended up being a huge success. It sold millions of copies, and it's why they entrusted him with Raiders of the Lost Ark. And whenever they were given the rights to make E.T., being that it was on short notice, they thought he would be the only one that could pull it off.
Yes, I wanted to point out, by the way, you mentioned earlier that Raiders of the Lost Ark was very successful. It was designed by this man, Howard Scott Warshaw, who had already had great success with Yars Revenge. He comes out with the very first video game adaptation of a movie ever and essentially single-handedly makes it another great game. So while there are definitely bad ideas in this story, I think we can argue pretty conclusively that giving this project to Howard Scott Warshaw was not one of them.
Part of the problem with this is Howard Scott Warshaw wanted to make the best game possible, and he was very ambitious with this. He enjoyed working for Spielberg, and so he wanted to make something that was memorable. He had 3D elements, he had wind conditions. It was one of the first games with open world exploration, and it was also the first to include a title screen. Like, he put a lot of effort into making this game just something special, and he just did not have the time to polish it.
There have been analyses of exactly what specifically was wrong with E.T., but from what I understand, while there were a lot of innovations that Howard Scott Warshaw included, the problem was that all of those innovations made it a very complicated game and not easy to play.
Yeah, it was basically Dark Souls of its time, because with weird hitboxes and everything, you would continuously fall into these pits, and it also had a weird story. You were basically just collecting parts of a phone to phone home. So, like, people thought that was kind of nonsensical. It didn't fit that much with the movie, and it was just a bizarre game that was so brutal and so hardcore that basically kids could not make any progress on it. Anytime they started to make progress, like a fully locked in FBI agent would come and take them off the map and carry them somewhere. A scientist would come in and take them to the city and lock them up, and it was just this game where you never really got to progress. And while it did include some really cool stuff, like it had a bunch of Easter eggs for Yar and for Indiana Jones. Like if you went up to like some of the flowers that are in the game and did this little like E.T. bobbhead thing to it, it would actually turn into one of the Yar icons. Like, he put some really hard effort into it, but it could have, like, I always wonder what would this game have been if he would have had another month or even 2 months or a normal cycle. If he would have had 6 months to come out with it, this might have been like what really put video game movies into like into the forefront. It seemed like there was a huge missed opportunity here.
I also think a big problem with this game was that Atari overextended themselves, and I'm sure you'll get into this, but initial sales of this game were actually very strong because you slap a picture of E.T. on the front and, you know, nobody has played the game yet. You rush it out for Christmas and all the kids have just seen E.T. and they think he's cute. And so the first wave of news about this was, hey, we're selling a lot. It's all good stuff.
Yeah, and they had huge marketing campaigns for it. They reshot the beginning of E.T. where he throws the ball and the ball rolls back. Well, this time E.T. throws the video game back. Like, they had 2 different commercial spots, hundreds of different spots for magazines, and they were just pushing it out there very hard. And at the time, nobody really knew that Atari was about to get into some pretty dire financial straits. Like, the CFO for Atari called the CEO and basically showed him what the new budget was going to be. And they were about to fire 80% of their workforce. It was going to go from 10,000 to 2,000, like, almost overnight, with how quickly everything was piling up. So you add in the failure of this game after it has an initial bustle, and then it just kind of starts dropping off, and they actually have to change the way video game returns work, because nowadays you can't return a game because you didn't like it, and that kind of started because of E.T. Like, so many companies were just taking returns on this and sending the money back, and Atari was having to deal with it, that they were just piling up in warehouses.
I would also point out, Atari had made some very bad management systems, and not just in E.T.'s realm, although we can demonstrate it with E.T., because they produced so many of these cartridges. There were more cartridges of E.T. produced than there were Atari consoles that were capable of playing them. They set themselves up for this failure. There was no way they could sell all of these cartridges that they'd made.
Well, they anticipated that over the course of that year, they were going to sell another 10 million Atari systems, and they spent money like they had already sold them. So that was one of the biggest mistakes that they made. You think you're going to sell 10 million consoles, then you're going to sell at least 2 or 3 games per console, sometimes more, sometimes less, and like you figure that's going to be a pretty good model. You're talking about a company that was just riding high off of millions of dollars of revenue after just a couple of years. But that huge growth model just didn't happen. It was a market that was oversaturated. Not every single family needed an Atari in their home at that point. Shortly thereafter, the video game industry was pretty much labeled dead. Many people thought it would never recover. It took companies like Nintendo and Sega and everything else to kind of resurrect it from the ashes of this. And people wondered why, in the middle of 1985, why you couldn't get new Atari games, why it had just dried up. But that was essentially what happened, is just a lot of mismanagement, a lot of overspending of money. They only had so many devs making games, but they had thousands of people doing marketing, doing distribution, doing everything else, and they just couldn't sustain that model. Plus, with E.T., they made 4 million units that ended up, like, most of them being returned or unsold. So you just had a lot of garbage sitting in warehouses. And it just, like, it was the perfect storm to just sink Atari within a couple of years.
So what did they do with all these ET games? Did they sell them off at like $1 a piece and cut their losses?
No, they emptied the warehouses into the desert. It turns out that the urban legend behind Atari dumping the ET cartridges in Alamogordo was a true story. This is detailed in the Atari Game Over documentary by Zach Penn. He teams up with the writer of Ready Player One, Ernest Cline, to go and find out what happened with these cartridges, along with a bunch of I think they called themselves punk archaeologists, like people trying to dig up like current pop culture in landfills and things like that. And so they go to this place, and based off of a few pictures that showed the journalists taking pictures of the games being dumped, they were able to localize where they possibly could be, and they started drilling down and taking core samples of this landfill. And there was a lot of strange, objections to this. People knew that they had buried like mercury-laden pigs there, and they thought it was just going to like release toxic vapors everywhere. So there was initially some
superhero.
Yeah, I mean that's generally what happens. I mean Ernest Cline probably was hoping for that, but like so you've got this just spot in the desert, and they end up digging down and they find some mail from 1983 in September, and they decide that's where they're going to try it out. And over the course of several months, they get all the permits necessary for this, and they actually were able to find the lost cartridges. They were able to dig down. It was about 28 feet down for a part of a landfill that hadn't been used in probably about 25 years. And they were able to recover these. They first found a little joystick in the detritus there, and then they pulled out a single ET cartridge, and after that they were able to start pulling out all of them. And what they ended up finding wasn't just ET, it was actually a huge assortment of different Atari games. Alongside this terrible ET game, there was actually Centipede and Yar and so many of the other games that they had been creating for a long time. It was just an entire warehouse dump that they put into this landfill. So really, it felt more like this was the actual burying of Atari as a whole than it was them just trying to cover up a single mistake with E.T. It was them just getting rid of what was taking up space because they had to. And it was really interesting to see this because Howard Scott Warshaw, the one who created this game, was there for this unearthing, and he didn't expect any sort of response to be there, maybe a news crew or something, and it turned out that there were actually huge mobs of people braving a sandstorm to just watch at the chance that they might find these games. And he watched as these people came to talk about a thing that he had finished 30 some years ago, and to remember like him and his other games fondly, as well as like just kind of look back at this one major mistake of his career, the mistake that cost him his career in gaming.
And I do like his story, right? He starts out high, he gets out of gaming low, and then he moves on to reinvent himself. The great thing about, what's his name? Howard Scott? I closed his page.
Howard Scott Warshaw.
The great thing about Howard Scott Warshaw is that he went on to become a psychotherapist. And not just any psychotherapist, a psychotherapist who helps struggling programmers deal with their failures.
Yeah, and he went directly to just deal with something he has so much experience in that he's probably one of the only qualified people that is a psychotherapist to talk to.
And he's definitely took some lemons and made lemonade out of them.
Yeah, and in this he seemed to have a pretty good He had a pretty good mentality about it. He seemed like he was coping with it well. He had moved on. There were moments where you could see he was a little overwhelmed with emotion, like whenever he was actually at that site, or he went back to the old Atari building for the first time in 30 years. But I think almost anyone would be a little overwhelmed with nostalgia with something like that, especially because it was such a huge lifestyle change. He talked about that too, about how like everything he did after that seemed kind of muted, seemed a little bit quieter and less intense and less fun than his time spent at Atari. But he did end up on his feet there, and he seems to be doing pretty well for himself.
I have a question for you, Tony, that you may not be able to answer.
All right.
But it's something I'm wondering. Why did Atari bury these games? What was the benefit to them?
I think it was mostly just to clear out warehouse space so they didn't have to keep paying for it.
So like there was no way they could sell any of this cheaply enough to make it worth their while to try to sell it?
Well, considering it was like September 1983 and they didn't go out of business for like another year after that, it seems like they might have just been trying to bury that game, and that's part of why the urban legend was there. Like, they might have just known that ET wasn't worth salvaging and just dumped what was there, but because it was only 10% of what they found in that landfill, I honestly think they were just trying to liquidate assets and they didn't have time to figure anything out. They just dumped it. Also, these technically became the property of the city of Alamogordo, so I'm not sure if they ended up doing anything with these. The mayor said that they were going to sell them on eBay, but I'm not 100% sure if that ever happened. I
wanted to know kind of more about Atari and like the failures of the video game industry as a whole. I feel like we could have had a little bit more of that. Do you have like just a summary you can...
I've got a bunch of notes over here. Like, I did talk about how afterwards Nintendo and Sega kind of picked up the torch.
Right, but I mean, what were they doing that nerfed... Like, despite the legend, E.T. is not what killed the video game industry. One game was not enough to sink everything. They were making other bad decisions. I just kind of wanted
I think
a little more information.
I don't have any like solid information on that. I think a lot of it could be that they were just trying to come out with too many games too quickly. Because whenever you talk to developers, they will tell you that E.T. was not the worst game ever, and not even the worst on Atari. There were tons of games that were so much worse than this one. This game had some ambition, and it didn't always hit where it wanted to, but at least it was trying some new things, whereas there were a lot of just rip-offs and other things. So I think people had stopped buying as many games for the console. They had already had a bunch of games, and they were just playing what they had instead of going out and buying new ones. You could go to a friend's house and play, so you didn't need your console at home. Like, there's a lot of reasons that could have contributed to that.
I think also a big thing that started happening, in addition to all the negative side of Atari, was that you started seeing home computing be a thing, and the things like the Commodore 64 came out. It may not have been a 64 at that point, but the Commodore line of computers could play games, and you could have them hooked up to a screen like your television screen, but they were also capable of running programs like word processors and things like that. And so the console industry was selling some things at the same or greater rates than these early home PCs were selling for, and there just wasn't the appeal anymore.
Yeah, you could actually get some work done and like do accounting and all these other things on your Commodore, whereas the Atari was a little bit limited. I know that there were a lot of people who started cutting their teeth on certain Atari systems with programming and everything, but if you were going to do that, you would be better off using like a Commodore or some of the other systems that were coming out around then.
If you guys are interested in the other side of this story, by the way, I would highly recommend the book Super Mario: How Nintendo Conquered America, which details the upswing, the things that Nintendo had to do to dig the reputation of video games out of the ground that Atari built. That Nintendo had to do to dig the reputation of video games out of the ground that Atari buried it in. If you want to see a good, successful company figure out a way to navigate its way through changing waters and various changes in the economy and consumer tastes in video games, I highly recommend that book.
Yeah, and you can also see about how they just deal with changing waters by changing the way their characters look and releasing the same game every 8 years.
A little bit of salt from Tony. And yet the Switch is still very, very popular. And
I wouldn't mind trying to Switch, in all honesty.
Oh, I want a Switch. I want one.
I want the little SNES and the NES thing too, but those aren't going to happen.
All right, time to stop piling on Nintendo.
That's true.
Is that it for this week?
I believe that's it for this week.
Well, thanks everybody so much for listening. If you have bad ideas that you would like us to cover, send them to badideasshow@gmail.com. We're always looking for new stuff in the folder. We like things that we can flesh out as much as possible, and we also like finding out things that maybe we didn't know about. So if there's an obscure failure that has an interesting story behind it, or a public failure that maybe there are some details about that aren't very well known, we'd love to hear about those kinds of things. And we'll see you guys next time with another episode of Bad Ideas.
Bye, everybody.